Okay, so today we're going to talk about game setting. As I mentioned, this is really like the beginning of week 3, and we're still working on the character design and animation assignment. So we're just kind of getting this set up for next week, but we'll do the work related to this next week. So we're going to talk about game setting, and for the next series of lectures, for a couple weeks, we're going to be trying to kind of situate the aesthetics of games with their functionality and talk about the different conventions of how games look and how we put them together. So when it comes to setting, we're uh, obviously talking about the setting. And the setting tends to refer to aspects of the game that are not part of the functionality of the game, aspects of the game that are just giving us aesthetic indicators of where we are in the world and what type of world we're in. So game setting is a little bit different from like level design. Level design uses the setting, but this is more kind of like the general aesthetics of the game and what we can kind of read into those aesthetics. So I have this little picture of like an aquarium as an example here. And the thing I like about this is we can, as observers, we can see the structure of the aquarium, and we can see how it fits together, and we can see what the boundaries and the different components of the aquarium are. But we could imagine if we were fish and we were living in this aquarium, we'd have a much different idea of what the actual like boundaries and parameters of this world are. And that's part of what the setting of a game helps communicate to us. So we can see one of the things I like about this is that each one of these sort of like areas of the fishbowl of the aquarium has pretty simple elements. There's like a sand floor, there's a green leaf, and then there's in most cases a leaf of a different color. So you could think of the one at the bottom as like the red leaf world, and the one at the top is the purple leaf world. And there's these like distinctive features that have things in common but also have differences. And we can think of the setting that way as kind of like creating the aesthetic of the world so we know what kind of world we're in. So in an aquarium, obviously we're recreating a realistic kind of idea of the ocean where we have a sand floor and we have these plants. But your setting doesn't have to be realistic. You could imagine an aquarium that has a spaceship in it or other things that may not fit with the other elements. But we're also communicating sort of the different parts of the world through the setting. So game setting versus world building, just kind of like talking about some different terms and how they overlap and how they're different. Uh, uh, World building refers to the general practice of inventing a fictional universe where a game or a story takes place. So coming up with the different characteristics of that universe. And world building often refers to things that we don't necessarily see in the game, but developing the idea of the world that the game is in, and then the setting communicates aspects of that world to the user or player. So when we create that setting, we're thinking through all of the scenic elements of a game and how we can use those elements to give the player a sense of the world that they're in. So the fictional world may be much larger in scope than what the player sees, but the setting elements reveal that world to the player. So the game setting doesn't have to have everything that world might have, but it has to have enough to understand, to communicate the basic premise of that game. So you're obviously not going to have, in a game, you can't have the same amount of detail that you have in the real world. You can't have millions and millions of different objects that are hyper realistic the way that we do when we're walking around in the building here or on the street or whatever. But we can use the aesthetics of the real world or imaginary worlds to communicate where we are inside of a game through specific scenic design. So then game setting versus level design. Setting generally refers to what we can see in the world, things that we don't interact with. So objects, backgrounds, and other visuals that create the scene or scenery. Level design is a more complex topic that has to do with the way that the user moves through the world, and that involves parts of the setting, but also the physics of the world, interaction, obstacles, everything else that goes into creating the flow through the game. So a few types of game worlds. We can think about different types of worlds that we could place a game in. And this relates a little bit to genre, but we can talk about like these different settings and what makes them unique. So let's start with fantasy. What are some examples of game worlds in the that would communicate fantasies? Yeah. Okay. Okay. RuneScape, World of Warcraft. Jonathan said D&D. Okay. And so, what do those things have in common? What makes those things fantasy as opposed to something else? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And Jonathan also said dragons. So yeah, fantasy is basically things that couldn't exist in our real world. So a fantasy setting is going to have things like dragons that communicate to the player. This world doesn't use the same rules as the world that you live in. That's your favorite? Okay. Perspective world. Something about the character's perspective is changed. So this one is a little bit tricky, but I think you guys might be able to think of some examples of this. And I'll also give one of my favorite previous student examples. Anybody familiar with a perspective world and what that means in terms of our setting and our game world? So it's not point of view like first person, but perspective like from the perspective of like a particular character. This one is a little bit trickier. Um, Sonic could be a good one. I think there's also a lot of like blending of these different types. Pac-Man is like I guess you could, yeah. So Pac-Man, I wouldn't call a perspective world um, because, well, it's kind of hard to explain why. So let me give an example, and maybe you guys will think of other ones. So one example that a student gave at some point, maybe a couple semesters ago, was this game called Octodad. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this game. It's called Octodad. And so this is a game where you play as like an octopus, but you are trying to pretend that you're a dad in like a human setting. And so it's a physics-based game, and basically you have to try to like move the octopus and accomplish tasks without people noticing that you're an octopus. And so uh, that's kind of the premise of the game. And so what makes this a perspective world game is that there's a character in the world who has a different perspective that nobody else in the world has. And so basically, the dynamics of the game are created by the difference between the player character and everybody else. The player character is trying to basically work within the boundaries of the game, but the octopus is the only part of the game that isn't part of a more realistic simulation. So this one character's perspective on the world. Does that kind of make sense? Can you guys think of other examples? Katamari is a good example. You guys know that game, Katamari? It's a classic. We'll probably talk about it. I think I have some examples of it in some other lectures, but it's a very hard to explain. It's probably easier just to show an image. Um, Probably better to show a video. It's kind of hard to explain, but you're just like uh, rolling this ball around and it collects all of the items in the world. I don't know. I haven't played in a while. Somebody else might be able to give a better description of it, but I think I have it as examples in some other places as well. Um, so let's keep going. So our world, this is a pretty obvious one, but what are some examples of games that take place in our world? Okay, what? Sorry, say it again. Oh, you said the same. Yeah, the same one. Hitman. Okay. GTA. Yeah. Sports games. Yeah, that's a good example. Like FIFA or Madden, that type of game. Wii Sports, I feel like, is a little more of a fantasy version of sports, but it definitely is like referencing. But yeah, those are good examples. I think like The Sims is an example that a lot of people often go to. Our world is just like, our world. It's recreating, it's can be simulation, it's anything that kind of like is trying to faithfully recreate the look and physics and aesthetics of our just normal world. Sci-fi. So sci-fi settings, you guys can probably think of some examples of those. What? Sword art online? Okay. What were you gonna say? Final Fantasy. Although Final Fantasy is that sci-fi? Does it have it has sci-fi elements? Sword art online. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Virtual reality. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I haven't heard of that one. That sounds cool. And so what do sci-fi? Uh, Elden Ring. What is sci-fi? Halo is a good one. Nier Automata. Yeah. Metal Gear. Yeah. What? Metroid. I don't know F-Zero. What's up? F-Zero. Okay. Yeah. That looks sci-fi. It's like hovercrafts or something. Um, Ori and the Blind Forest. I don't know that one. Take a look. Oh, Metroidvania. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. That looks cool. Good. Huh. Yeah, that looks cool. So yeah, so sci-fi uh, should be. So what makes sci-fi setting different from other settings? Like as opposed to fantasy or perspective world, what makes sci-fi? What separates sci-fi from those settings? Okay. Yeah. Things that might be real in the future. So it's not exactly fantasy because it has a scientific basis, but it doesn't exist yet. Um, so yeah, similar. It's more realistic. Mallory said sci-fi focuses on technology as a sort of means which the world has made extraordinary, uh, and that's sort of like a really natural or like organic looking game. Yeah. Um, But yeah, that's a good point. So sci-fi is kind of using technology and science as a basis for creating things that don't exist. So there's obviously a lot of fantasy mixed in with sci-fi. Some sci-fi is more sort of faithful to what we know about science already in the real world about physics and computing and different technologies. Some sci-fi is very strictly, science-based. Some of it is more speculative or adds elements of fantasy in there. But that's the main kind of distinction, is that it's not strictly fantasy where things are just made up. There's a scientific or speculative or technology-based reason for the things that are not part of the normal world. Mallory said, sci-fi versus fantasy as a dichotomy can sometimes also be thought of as technology versus magic. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. That's a good point. Okay, historical or period setting. Can you guys think of some examples of historical or period? I can't show both of them. That's okay. Historical or period setting. Yeah. I actually haven't. It's like one of those games that's been on my list forever. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Age of Empires. Yeah. Were you gonna say what? Say it again. Sorry, I can't. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, Civilization. Yeah. 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 Civilization is a good. Yeah. Um. And yeah, Mallory said that Assassin's Creed, Crusader Kings, Europa Universalis, Universalis, Day of Defeat. Those are all good ones. So yeah, it's pretty. What is it called? Boo 2? Oh, is this a historical? Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it has like a historical theme, Egyptian aesthetics and stuff. So that's a good example. Yeah, looks good. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. When the setting has historical or period elements to it, Assassin's Creed is a good example where they really work hard in that series to kind of like faithfully recreate these ancient worlds. So that's a good example. Um, and then mythological. So this one's kind of similar, but what are some mythological games, and what are the differences between historical and mythological? Yeah. Sorry. God of War. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Norse mythology. Yeah. Okay. Zoo Tycoon. Uh, yeah. Uh, um, but yeah, I think those are good examples. So, um, mythological. The the difference there is that a mythological game can borrows from a shared sort of like set of fictional characters or fictional stories. So usually that's something that like Norse gods or Greek gods or Egyptian, something that we all are familiar with, and there's a shared reference there. So with a historical game, when you play Assassin's Creed, you might not be familiar with the history that they're referencing. So part of what makes it fun is learning about it. On the other hand, with mythological, part of what makes that fun is you recognize these different stories and different characters in the game. So there's a shared component to the fiction that the game takes advantage of. And yeah, Mallory says mythological draws from existing folklore, legends, pantheons of supposed divinities, etc. Very well. All right. Oh, and then fictional world. So this one is borrowing from an existing fiction. So an example would be like the Star Trek video game. So it's a fictional thing that already exists, and then the game uses those characters and those conceits and premises to create the game for that. And so in the setting, the elements of like the Star Trek game should be referencing parts that are recognizable from the TV series. Yeah, yeah, right. So yeah, that's a good example or a good thing to think about. Nintendo in particular is very protective of their intellectual property. Um, Usually, like with this Star Trek game, most likely if it's a mass-produced game, they probably had some sort of licensing fee, or either it's a company that has a licensing fee for the intellectual property, or the company that actually produces Star Trek might just produce the game themselves. They might hire out like a game design firm to actually make the game itself. Um, for something like you're talking about, which is like a Mario, like maybe like a satirical Mario game or something that's referencing Mario. Oh, it's a fan game. So yeah. So yeah, there's different rules, and there's especially one of the interesting things with that is there's very different rules in the U.S. than there is in Japan regarding intellectual property. In the US, we actually have pretty loose intellectual property rules. So, for example, if I take characters from a video game, but I put them into a different context, especially if I'm doing commentary or doing something transformative with those characters, that's usually something that's allowed. Whereas in Japan, they're a lot more strict about using recognizable intellectual property. So that's a lot of where that type of conflict will come from. But it's kind of funny because I'll show some examples of games like that reference Mario um, in later uh, in later lectures. Okay, so let's continue. So talk a little bit about physical dimensions. And so we'll get into this next week as we start to build out our scenes. But one of the things that we really want to be careful about is choosing the physical dimensions of the game setting because we want our character to be visible. We want the components of our scene to be, easy to understand. And one of the things that can be hard is getting those physical dimensions right. Um, Another component is using 2D versus 3D graphics. Usually this is something that you kind of decide from the beginning whether you're making a 2D game or a 3D game, but the setting obviously is going to change and the elements that you use in the game will change depending on what type of 2D or 3D game you're making. The boundaries of the game are also part of the setting, also part of the level design. So it kind of is overlaps with both of those topics a little bit. In some games, we have very clearly defined boundaries. So, like Tetris, we can see the entire world of the game on one screen. Other games, we can't see the boundaries of the game. So, the setting is used to communicate what the boundaries are. Like, if we can walk somewhere, usually the setting will make it clear that we can go in whatever directions we can go. The scale is another consideration. So realistic games are going to try to make things look at normal scale. Games that use fantasy, and here's another Katamari reference, will change the normal scale of the world in order to make interesting physics or make things easier to see or easier to understand or emphasize certain things. So depending on what type of world you're creating, the scale of things is important to consider. Here's The Sims with everything kind of scaled to look realistic. And here's, oh yeah, I do actually in this in these slides have Katamari, so we can see the scale of Katamari. There's aspects of it that are realistic, but then of course there's aspects of it that play with that boundary of realism. So this is actually next week, but we're going to be talking about Scenic Elements. So on Tuesday, I'll be doing a demo, making some art and adding it into our game. These, again, are non-player characters, things that we're not interacting with. And so the things that we're going to be thinking about are the terrain, like where we are, where we're walking, what sort of like makes up the ground of this world. And then flora and fauna is a big aspect of this. Rules, like if we can see if there's gravity in the game, that will affect how the setting is set up, where things are in the world. Flora and fauna is like plants and animals. So the plants of the world, the other creatures that inhabit the world, but again, things that we're not interacting with. So the real difference with setting versus other stuff that we're going to make later in the semester is that we can't actually change the setting. The setting is just kind of there, and we can't interact with it. So as we're considering these different elements, screen space is another thing that we want to consider. The screen, whether we're in 2D or 3D, the screen is always the same thing. It's just a 2D plane. And so there's different ways of dividing up that space to create dimensionality in the game, using a background and a foreground. So part of what we'll do is add a background to the game, using vertical space, using horizontal space. So depending on the style of the game, if we're making a platformer, we're going to be using horizontal space to show the setting, but some platformers also use vertical space more or use both. So those are kind of the considerations that we'll look at. Another aspect of the setting that we might not always consider is physical time. So for most games, time is kind of an afterthought. We just use the basic physics of the game. But in a lot of games, and you could probably think of some examples, time doesn't act like it acts in the real world. So you could probably think of examples of games where time is either sped up or slowed down. Any examples? Okay. Okay. What? 12 minutes? I don't know that one. Okay. Right. So what happens in this game? Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh. Okay. Yeah. I feel like I've seen movies like that, but that's cool. I didn't know about this game. I'll have to check that out. Um, so yeah, does time move forward? Does it move at a constant rate? Can the user control time? Um, so super hot is like a good example of this, where we can control the time uh, in the game, and that's like a big part of the game mechanic. Oh, I don't know that one. What happens in that one? Okay, right. Got it. Got it. Yeah. Uh, oh, okay. Yeah, that's cool. Cool. Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, it's a little hack. Uh-huh. I haven't played that one. Okay. Yeah. 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 Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. 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 That's funny. All right. So getting some inspiration. So you guys saw the aquarium that I posted up there. I like using like stuff like this to get inspiration because an aquarium and similar things are similar to games in that we have to make very deliberate choices. So this is just an article with a lot of different aquariums. And you can see that the setting, there's aspects of the world that we can communicate with the setting. And then there's like very specific choices that are made because aquariums usually only have like a few specific elements that have to communicate a whole world in a small space. So I like looking at aquariums. I like looking at gardens because they kind of do the same thing. So yeah, you guys will probably have other inspirations, but these are just some that I like to consider to get through this ad. So yeah, this goes through some of the processes of designing a garden, and it talks about the different elements. So like color is the first one that it talks about, like choosing the different colors. That's really good for a game if you have a recognizable color scheme that you can change and adapt on different levels and things like that. So choosing colors, varying the height of the different plants in the garden will make it more interesting. So having variation in the game. Let's see some of the other tips that they do. Different textures, colorful foliage. Yeah, so these types of things are, I think, useful to consider when you're creating the setting of the game so that you're not just doing the default thing every time. So yeah, I've linked to a bunch of these. We don't have to watch all of them, but you guys can check those out if you want to. This one is landscape design. This one actually is good. I think it has like, yeah, 10 different uh, lessons, they call it. And they show these different landscapes. Contrast, texture, uh, color is always going to be one. Scale, as we talked about. Repetition, that's actually a good one. So using repetition, obviously it's easy to do in games because we have a lot of sprites and then we can repeat them. But using repetition and creating patterns makes things easy to understand. Rhythm, sequence. Sequence is kind of more like level design, but yeah, we'll talk about that more. Yeah. Other stuff like this, terrariums, similar kind of deal where you have to like choose a few elements that work well together to communicate the setting in a small space. Aquascaping. So again, this is just like something that I like to look at. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is where you have to find your inspiration, but a lot of time, like we looked at with the character design, instead of just like starting from nothing and just drawing pixels on the screen and just like hoping it turns out good, it's good to come up with some principles that you follow through the designs, so that you're not just kind of making random choices as you go. Okay, so that